from the current law. So if these are issues are there for companies which are purely a partnership companies or the family-owned businesses, or where the corporate structure is not as important or as required, how you can change from company to LLP, or whether LLP will be better than the company for those people. To understand all these things, we have with us Anup Shah, the power company's benefit cost detail way forward to LLP. After this session, we have the breakout and thereafter a group photograph in the lawn. So all are requested to assemble there. In the evening, we also have Antakshari by Chairman Vijay Bhatt at 6:30, along with Bollywood news in this conference room only. So all will get assembled by 6:30. Have entertainment, thereafter we have dinner and then the karaoke. With this viewers, I hand over the proceedings to the advisor of the Allied Law Committee, Shri Praveen Veera. Thank you.
President Shri Bhaspai, Vice President Avinash,
Chairman Allied Laws Committee Vijay Bhai, Chairman Corporate Members Committee
Shri Vipul Bhai Oxley,
past presidents, dear son Anup, and all my friends and delegates here. It gives me a pleasure to welcome you all today on the second day of our first RRC on allied laws and related topics. When this committee was started, I was the fortunate first one with the blessings of Patil Saab to be the chairman of this committee. And since then, it was the Patil Saab's confidence which he had reposed that I am lucky to see the committee growing and growing. And every year becomes a new milestone which makes a challenge to the new coming chairman to achieve something still more and more. The way Avinash was functioning at that time, I had expressed the desire that Avinash, हमारा भी एक RRC होना चाहिए. And today I feel immensely happy that that dream has come true with the great efforts of the entire team, and particularly these two chairmen, Vipul Bhai and Vijay Bhai. They have put their efforts beyond any limit to see that this RRC becomes a reality. Coming to my task of giving the introduction of Anup, is very well considered biodata is there in the paper book, but what is given in the paper book is very precise summary of what Anup is. But in any event, what is highlighted there is enough to indicate what is his strength, what is his caliber, what is his ability. I will not go into that. I consider that as read. What I will like to say is something different. ગુજરાતી માં આપણે કહીએ છીએ ને કે મોરના ઈંડાને ચિતરવા ન પડે. He carries a very good tradition of his father, respected Dr. Praveen P. Shah, one of the very well-learned, meticulous professional who was not only good as a professional, but much more better as a human being. Respected Praveen Bhai carries tremendous respect in the heart of everyone who came across or had an opportunity to meet him. And during the same course, I had the opportunity to meet Anup. Within just 2 or 3 meetings with Anup, he became like a son for me. I feel that much comfort with him. So today I feel proud that I have been given an opportunity to introduce his son. See, what is important in today's paper, friends, you will realize that considering any new amendment, we feel it takes time for us to study, digest it, and masterly have a grip over those changes. Yesterday we heard Dinesh Bhai, we heard Anand Bhatia. Today we are having the third one. We really, from the bottom of our heart, salute these people. how within a short period of time they masterly pick up the new changes and the manner in which they are trying to share their knowledge. In today's paper also, which is there for presentation friend, you will realize how each and every changes that has been brought by the new act which affects the private company, limited companies, and what can be the possible way out by resorting to the possible revenue of going to LLP has been very effectively highlighted by Anup in his paper. While coming across the different aspects of the matters which he is going to discuss in his presentation, you will all realize that he has tried to conceive the ideas on points much more than what we can imagine. Because as a solicitor, sometimes there are some laws we come across, similarly limited liability also. But the manner in which Anup has analyzed the problems and he has tried to suggest the possible solution, I am sure for you all, it will be a very interesting session. At the end of the session, you will be all feel much happier that you have learned in 1.5 hours what by spending 150 hours also you may not be able to study. As far as his craze for knowledge is concerned, it reminds me of Ghalib. His desire to learn is such a tremendous thing. ख्वाहिश है ऐसी कि हर ख्वाहिश पे दम निकले, ख्वाहिश है ऐसी कि हर ख्वाहिश पे दम निकले, बहुत निकले मेरे अरमान गालिब फिर भी कम निकले. That is his desire to learn. Friends, with these few words I will introduce none other than Anup. Thanks for me. I will now request our President Paras Bhai to offer memento to Anup as a mark of our love and affection. The act is limited liability partnership, but there is no limit to Anup's knowledge.
Thank you very much, Praveen Bhai, and good morning to everybody. At the outset, a small complaint. Our president, over the past 2 years, has invited me on several occasions to give a talk. And he's so creative that whenever he calls me, he comes up with complex, convoluted topics which involve multiple laws, multiple things. So if you look at the topic, he wants me to have a private company, give you a crash course on what's laws, what's retained, way forward through LLP, include restructuring and also look at the tax and stamp duty issues. All this in 1.5 hours. And this is quite a regular feature. So next time Paras invites me, I'm going to have to think whether to say yes or no because he makes me work very hard. Coming to the Companies Act, it reminds me of an analogy. A few years ago, all Bollywood movies were scripted by Salim Javed. So they were a hit pair and everything had your typical element of action, drama, tragedy. This Companies Act is also scripted by two individuals, Roy and Raju. So it is everything is either because of Mr. Roy or because of Mr. Raju. So just as Newton's third law says every action has an equal and opposite reaction, here every action of Roy or Raju has an equal and opposite section. So they just went through the case papers and came out with an act, okay, this is what you shall not do because Mr. Roy or Mr. Raju did that. So let us analyze what has happened to the private limited companies case which we so love and which we consider to be so dear for entrepreneurial spirit in India. Why it is a dying breed? As my good friend Mr. Ajay Sikri said, save the tiger. I think we're going to have a save the private limited company agenda very soon. And soon we'll be telling stories that once upon a time there lived a private limited company and our future generation will ask, wo kya tha? So let's look at why it's such a dying breed. If you look at the company statistics, this is from MCA's website. 8.88 lakh companies are private limited companies. Only 64,000 are public, of which only 8,000 odd are listed. So, of which only 4,000 odd are actively traded, and of which only 1,000 matter. So, for these 1,000 companies, everybody is being penalized. Now, let's look at the small notices which are yet very much there, but we don't know whether they are going to remain for long. The definition of a private limited company has also been tweaked compared to the earlier act. It requires a minimum capital of 1 lakh, which is same as before. The minimum number of members are 2 and maximum could be 200. Now this is a good change. Earlier you only had 50. Now it has gone up to 200. So that's a sizable sum which you can have in a private limited company. Joint shareholders continue to be treated as single members. There is a prohibition on invitation to public to subscribe to securities. Now if you pause for a moment, under the 56 Act, the prohibition was on invitation to shares and debentures. Now it has been replaced by securities. And securities are as defined under Section 2H of the Securities Contract Regulation Act. So you have a much wider spectrum. All of those would be prohibited for invitation to public. This again is an outcome of the Sahara episode. Earlier definition prohibited deposits from other than members, directors or relatives. That is now being removed. So should we celebrate? Answer is no, because Section 73 anyway prohibits it under the public deposit rules. So this is just being removed from the definition section and put elsewhere. So it's not much of a change, it's just being transposed from one section to another section. Could you convert a public limited company into a private limited company? Theoretically, yes, but practically, why would anyone waste time and money on doing that? It is possible. Even a company formed under the 56 Act can be converted into a private limited company. You need to make an application to the ROC, amend the articles by a special resolution to incorporate the restrictions which we just looked at, and you could have a private limited company. Not that it makes much difference. Let's look at some changes where there are benefits of private limited yet compared to a public limited. Minimum number of members required in a public company are 7. It is 2 in a private company. Directors minimum are 3, 2 in case of a private company. You need a lady director in certain scenarios, even if you are unlisted. That is, if you have a capital in excess of 100 crores or a turnover in excess of 300 crores. That's not the case with a private limited company. You need an independent director if you have capital, turnover or loans in excess of certain thresholds for a public unlisted company. That's not so for a private limited company. You need an audit committee in certain scenarios, even for unlisted companies. So capital, turnover or loans, again not the case with a private company. Similarly, a nomination and remuneration committee is also required in those thresholds for an unlisted company which is public. Not so for a private company. This is something interesting, vigil mechanism. If you have public deposits or loans from banks and public financial institutions more than or equal to 50 crores, you need a vigil mechanism in a public company as well as a private company. What is that? We'll come to shortly. So all important things we're going to deal with shortly, but we're just looking at a snapshot. And you need central government approval for managerial remuneration in excess of Schedule 2? No, if you are not a subsidiary of a listed company. For a private company, it is only required if you have inadequate profits and you don't want to comply with the conditions of Schedule 5 and you don't want to comply with the alternative conditions given under Rule 7.2. If you don't want to comply with either of them, or if you are not in a position to comply with either of them, then and then only a private limited company which has inadequate or no profit requires central government approval. Key managerial person, an MD, a CEO, a full-time director, a CFO, a company secretary, all of these are required if you have a turnover in excess of 10 crores in a public company. For a private company, only a company secretary if the capital is in excess of 5 crores. Secretarial audit report required in a public company, not so in a private company in these cases. Postal ballot and e-voting only if you have more than 200 and 1,000 members, but you can't have more than 200 and 1,000 members in a private company, hence not applicable in a private company. Next, let's look at the paradise lost. What have we lost in a private limited company which we had earlier? What are the new conditions which are now applicable even to private limited companies? Rotation of auditor. Now this is something which most of us who are chartered accountants are well versed with, and Himanshu Bhai will be dealing with it more in depth. Incidentally, yesterday Nilesh Bhai and Anand and today Himanshu Bhai would be going into depth in certain aspects of company law, the whole Companies Act. What I am doing is not in depth but in breadth. So I will be taking you through the different provisions without going in depth because that's best left to their paper, but showing you what all is the snapshot and why it is a problem going forward. So the rotation of auditor applies even to a private limited company if you have a paid up capital in excess of 20 crores or borrowing for more than 50 crores and you have a 3 years transitional phase to comply with them. Interesting. An internal auditor is a must for private limited companies if you have a turnover of 200 crores in the last financial year, or banks or public financial institution loans in excess of 100 crores at any point of time. So it's a peak balance which you need to look at in the last financial year, and you must have complied by this by 1st October 14. Internal auditor need not be an external internal auditor. So even an employee of the company might be treated as an internal auditor, could be a chartered accountant, a cost accountant, or such some person. CSR is a must for private limited companies also. Now here there is a big myth prevalent, and I don't know where this crept in from. Whenever I give talks on CSR, the most popular question is, does this apply to private limited companies? Definitely. If you cross the 5 crores net profit threshold, which is very easy to cross even for a private company, CSR is mandatory. And remember friends, CSR is a one-way street. Once you enter the threshold, you continue to be covered by CSR even if you have a loss scenario, provided your 3 years average of net profits is a positive figure. So let's look at a case where today I have made a loss of 10 crores, but my average net profit of 3 years is a positive figure of 20 crores. I will have to pay 2% of that and increase my loss. So I continue to do charity and treat myself even though I am private, and that is what the law provides. So CSR is a one-way street. If you get caught in the net worth of 500 crores or turnover of 1000 crores or net profit of 5 crores or mutually exclusive, not cumulative conditions, then you need to contribute 2% of average net profit of the last 3 years. And you need a committee of 3 directors, of which one is independent, but for a private company, the relaxation is now to 2 directors, and you don't need any independent director. Incidentally, the question which also creeps up is, what is net profit? Is it net profit before tax or is it net profit after tax? When you look at net profit for average, it is very clearly specified to be before tax. But when you look at the thresholds, there is no clarity. In my view, it should be before tax on the basis of pari passu nature, as well as looking at the other provisions of CSR Act 135 and the rules, I would think it's before tax. You need an annual return certified by a practicing company secretary if your turnover or capital crosses the threshold, and the company secretary certificate is required along with it. Now this is very interesting and obnoxious. We had section 149(2) of the Companies Act of 1956, which provided that whenever a public company wanted to commence any business, it needed a certificate of commencement of business. And obviously, this requirement was not applicable to a private limited company. Now, the new Companies Act provides that whenever a private limited company wants to commence any business, it must file a declaration with the ROC stating that every subscriber has paid the value of shares agreed to be taken by him, file verification of its registered address with the ROC, and if it is not filed within 182 days from incorporation, the ROC can remove the name of the company from the register. So very harsh and in my view makes no sense. The director's report also includes the director's responsibility statement. Now this has been something which most independent directors have been crying foul about. And as an independent director on several listed and unlisted companies, this is something which I am the most scared of. So yesterday, Nilesh Bhai and I were discussing that as independent directors, what is the number one thing you fear? This is what I fear the most. Directors report under 134, it's so onerous and so wide that if you look at it and if you try to understand, it practically means that we are certifying everything under the sun. And those certifications have also been cast upon the private limited company directors. So what do they include? A director's responsibility statement that there are adequate accounting records, proper care for safeguarding assets. So now the director would have to undertake or get it undertook whether the assets have been safeguarded properly. Is insurance adequate? Is there proper physical verification of assets? Is there proper security of the assets? Is there a proper care for preventing and detecting fraud? How can you expect a director to certify something like that? And this is something which is very vast. A proper system to ensure compliance with all applicable laws. So all applicable laws, is there a system to comply with that? If there is a system like that, I would like to know one, because that person would have developed the best thing in India to comply with all applicable laws. And the last thing, the such systems were adequately and operating effectively throughout the year. So all this needs to be certified even by a director of a private limited company. And remember, mere rubber stamping won't do any more. You won't just sign off on 154 report. You will have to apply your mind. Because if there is any issue, the ROC is going to pull out the directors for the same. Vigil mechanism. The following classes of private limited companies, which are public deposits or borrowing from banks and public financial institutions in excess of 50 crores, must have a vigil mechanism. Now what is that? This is something like a whistleblower mechanism policy. So directors and employees who have genuine concerns and grievances, whom do they go to? If they go to the MD or they go to the chairman, it would be complaining to the ones who propounded the fraud or the problem. So therefore, there is a proper vigil mechanism set up where you can go and complain and vent your grievances. And you must nominate the director to whom concerns may be reported. Generally, in case of public and listed companies, the audit committee chairman functions as the chairperson of the vigil mechanism. But in case of a private limited company where an audit committee is not there, you would have to nominate somebody to be the person you hear. So he's like an ombudsman for the organization. And this person must provide for safeguards against victimization of complainants. So no witch hunting. If somebody comes and complains to you against the MD can't harass that person, can't hold a promotion or can't fire him without adequate cause, and all that will have to be seen by the vigil mechanism. Managerial remuneration limit. Now this is something where there has been a lot of ambiguity. Do the provisions of Schedule 5 apply to a private limited company? And if you see how section 196, 197.1, 197.2 and 197.3 are worded, it creates a lot of confusion. The way I read it is that if a private limited company has profits, it can do anything under the sun. It does not need any permission, it does not need to look at Schedule 5. If it has inadequate profits and or if it has losses and it wants to be managerial remuneration, then it needs to comply with the conditions of Schedule 5. That is the limit specified therein. If it wants to exceed the limit specified therein, then it needs to go to Rule 7, Sub-Rule 2 proviso, which gives you a gateway even from the limits laid down in Schedule 5. But if it does not or is not able to comply with 7.2, in that event only it would have to go to Central Government for permission. I am aware that there is another school of thought which says you don't need permission under any event at all, but I would not subscribe to that. Fortunately, the draft notification under section 462, which has been lying in the cold storage since June of this year, does provide for total exemption of central government approval to private limited companies, which in a way also supports what I am saying, that if there is already an exemption, where is the need for providing a further exemption? So, therefore, let's look at when do you need to go to central government. If you have inadequate profits or losses, central government approval is not required. However, conditions of Schedule 5 must be complied with. So you have similar to Schedule 13 of the 56 Act. If you want to go above the ceilings of Schedule 5, pass a board resolution, get it approved by a general meeting special resolution, and there must be no default in repayment of debts, debentures, interest or preference dividends for a continuous period of 30 days in the preceding financial year, and all accounts and annual returns have been filed on time with the ROC. If all of these are in place, no approval. But if one of these or none of these are not in place, then we need to go to central government for approval, is how I would do it. A comparison of the exemptions under the 56 Act and under the 2013 Act. Let us go by row and look at what we lost. Preferential allotment rules, there were the preferential allotment unlisted company rules of 2001, which were there under the 56 Act. Now they apply even to private limited companies. Differential voting right rules under section 105 and 106 were notified under the 56 Act, but only for public limited company, now applicable even to private limited company. This, in my view, is the single biggest deterrent to structuring private equity and FDI transactions when it comes to private limited companies. Let me look at them. Loans from shareholders were not a deposit, now they are a deposit. Loans from relative of directors were not a deposit, now they are a deposit, and it's not allowed. Public deposits, a public private limited company could raise under the 56 Act, now it cannot raise other than from members. Loans to directors and interested concerns, section 295 totally exempted private limited companies, 185 fully applies to private limited companies. Consolidation of accounts. Why would a private limited company consolidate accounts? Only listed companies consolidate accounts. Now, even private limited companies have to consolidate accounts. They have given a little bit of relaxations. We look at that when we come to that. Deposit for director's appointment. Whenever you want to appoint a director, you have to pay a deposit of 500 rupees. Now, he needs to pay 1 lakh rupees surety deposit, which gets forfeited if he either does not win or he gets less than 25% of votes in his favor. 1 lakh rupee deposit is going to scare away quite a few private limited company directors, unless the company funds it in some manner. Director of a private limited company, earlier when the ceiling of 20 companies was there, it was not counted in the overall ceiling of 20 companies. Now, it is counted in the overall ceiling of 20 companies. Further, within the new ceiling of 20 companies, maximum you can be a director in 10 public companies. And the proviso or the explanation provides, this includes a private limited company, which is a holding company of a public company, or which is a subsidiary of a public company. So that could also be treated as a public company for your 10 public companies. I can understand subsidiary, but holding company or public company automatically becomes public company. This is something which I obviously didn't study. So they studied a new law which I didn't. Director's disqualification. Default by private limited company did not disqualify its directors, now discovered. So you are in 74 1G type of a scenario where it is defaulted in paying interest and deposits under the old Act. Private limited companies were not covered, now even that's covered. So you have to be very careful if there is a default by a private company and you are, say there is some company within the group which is defaulted and you could be a director on a limited company, you would automatically suffer a disqualification by virtue of being a director on that private limited company. Bonus issue from revaluation reserve permissible earlier, now not possible. Resident director, no provision under the 56 Act. Now you need one resident director who is in India for at least 182 days in a year. Limit of intercorporate loans investments. Section 372A of the old Act did not apply to private limited companies in total. 186 applies to private limited companies also. ESOPs, you just needed to pass an ordinary resolution and you could have any conditions. Now it says you need a special resolution, which is okay. And more so, you need to comply with the rules specified. And the rules are nothing but a copy of the SEBI ESOP guidelines. So what you have is now the SEBI ESOP guidelines are applicable in totality to private limited companies also. So minimum 1 year vesting period, accounting date, all of that, which was earlier not mandatory, is now mandatorily thrust upon an ESOP of a private limited company. And that does impact you because in private limited companies, when they structure ESOPs, a lot of times you want to give super ESOPs to star performers. So what that happens is, let's say I want to quote somebody from a rival company. remuneration, I may not be able to give it much benefit because that disturbs my pay scale. But where can I give him the kicker? So I give him a super ESOP. I say, look here, my vesting is over 4 years, but for you, I'll do an accelerated vesting. 30% of all options vest upfront on the day of your joining. Balance 70 will be at par with my employees. And that's how a lot of IT companies use structured ESOP. Now you can't do this. You can't curtail your vesting period to 1 year because it says minimum vesting period of 1 year. So these sort of things in private limited companies, why should there be any regulation when they should be free to do what they want? Who's losing out in this? Nobody, because it's entirely a private affair. And if all the shareholders are agreeable, why should you have a problem? Auditor, no provision expressly, but now you cannot appoint a person who is in full-time employment or a partner of a firm if he has audit of more than 20 companies. Restrictions on powers of board, certain matters, 293A did not apply to private companies. Now, 180 applies and you need special resolution in such matters. So these matters could not be done only by board resolution. You need a special resolution, such as slum sale. So if a private company wants to sell their undertaking, it needs a special resolution of the board of the shareholders. Managerial remuneration we looked at. Now let's go in a little bit more detail and look at the major problems which we have in private limited companies. Preference shares, redeemable, compulsorily convertible, optional convertible. Voting rights, if no dividend declared, no dividend paid for 2 years. Earlier it only said no dividend paid. So that means even if you don't declare dividend for 2 years, you automatically give voting rights of preference shares. What is the fallout of this? If you look at the private equity space, or if you look at the angel investor space, the FDI space, a majority of them like to come in through CCPS or preference shares because it gives them certain additional benefits and they could also redeem it or they could go out as and when required. Now, if there is a default of not declaring dividend for any year, say there is a loss scenario for 2 years, automatically you end up giving voting rights on those preference shares, which you may not have liked to do in a normal case. So now you have no choice, but automatically you will end up giving voting rights if you don't declare dividend, whether dividend declared or not. Non-voting right shares, again impacting structure in space. Earlier, you could issue non-voting rights, special dividend rights, partial dividend rights under 105 because it did not apply to private limited companies. Now, the rules apply to private limited companies also. And what are the rules? They are quite onerous. You can go only up to 26% of the post-issued capital. You need a track record of distributable profits in the last 3 years. So again, a startup cannot do it, a loss-making company cannot do it. No default in filing any returns in the last 3 financial years. No default in paying declared dividend. Here they use the word declared dividend, whereas they use the word paid dividend. Repaying matured public deposits, matured debentures or interest. No default in repaying term loans. And not penalized in the last 3 years under RBI Act, SEBI Act, SCRA and FEMA. Thankfully, they did not include income tax or nobody would have been covered here. But just goes to show that this is such a vast and onerous condition thrust upon private limited companies makes life very difficult. Next, entirely thanks to Mr. Roy, private placement and preferential issue. This section, I think, got the maximum attention from the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. They drafted it so well that it's become a masterpiece. And if you look at the rules, it's really worth looking at that. You have section 42, which deals with private placement, and you have section 60(1)(c), which deals with preferential issue. Private placement says an offer made to a select group of people by way of a private placement letter, not being a public offer. And preferential issue under 62(1)(c), which is similar to our 81(1)(a), says that when you want to issue shares to anyone other than the existing shareholders, even if it includes the existing shareholders and someone else, it would be 81(1)(a). They came out with two terms, private placement, preferential issue. For the first time, both these terms have been defined. And then, when they came out with the rules, they said, what is the difference between this and that? Let us join both of them. So therefore, in the rules, they said that if it is a private placement, it must comply with preferential issue. And if it is a preferential issue, it always complies with private placement. So if you ask me, is there any difference? I would say no. Rules apply to private limited companies for issue of equity shares, CCPS, CCDs and warrants. They must be equity or equity linked convertible security. If it is an NCD or something, you need to look at whether they would apply. Through an offer letter under PS4, file an application form and with the ROC. Substantial disclosures need to be made by the company to the ROC. Would a private limited company like to give out all these disclosures to the ROC is the question. Because now, once it is with ROC, it's open for the world at large to see. Is this what we intend to do? And that is why several private limited companies are wary about this. You need to allot securities within 60 days of receipt of share application money. FDI rules allow you 180 days of allotment in receipt of share application money. 6 months has been curtailed to 60 days in case of FDI by the Companies Act, because the Companies Act being the mother statute to overrule all other laws, including FEMA, and therefore now FDI transactions also 60 days, no 6 months window. You cannot use the share application money for adjustment against allotment or refund. That's the only thing you can use it for. Else, repay within 15 days and thereafter interest at 12% per annum. So that's a very harsh provision. Minimum face value of 20,000 per investor. If you want to issue shares to any investor, you must be issued minimum face value of 20,000. Anything over and above that is fine, subject to income tax 5627B. But in terms of face value, it has to be 20,000 at least. And you need a special resolution for each offer. Validity of the special resolution is only 12 months. So if you do not act upon a resolution within 12 months, it would lapse. You need a fresh resolution and go through the process every time. Very difficult from fundraising transactions for private limited companies, but it now applies to them also. Next, in connection with this, you need a valuation report for equity shares, convertible preference shares, etc. No bar on issue at a premium under the Companies Act. Whether Income Tax Act allows you, is a difference to the issue at a discount is void. So section 79 of our old Act, you cannot issue a face value of 9 rupees if the normal face value is 10, except for sweat equity transactions. Issue price of preferential issue by unlisted companies determined on the basis of the report of the registered valuer. So you need a registered valuer which currently is not notified, therefore a chartered accountant with 10 years experience would do. And if it is consideration other than cash, the registered valuer must give justification for valuation. One very worrying feature here is in case of convertibles. It says in case of convertibles, you need to determine the price on the basis of which the conversion will take place today. Now, this was the same law which was there in the FDI policy. And then representations were made that you are not permitting an earn-out basis of valuation. That is, if I do good, you convert it a premium. If I do bad, you convert it a discount. And if I do as projected, you convert it as projected. So that gives the flexibility to the buyer and the seller of win-win, loss-win, lose. Now when you come out with a fixed basis of valuation, are you not taking away the flexibility of earn-out, and which is very prevalent in both domestic and foreign investment. Hence, it should be at par with that the minimum floor is fixed today. Anything over and above that could be open. Another question is, do I need to give a fixed price, or can I have a formula, or can I have a floor? It says determine the basis on which the price will be fixed. Now here different schools of thoughts are prevailing. The most narrow school of thought says basis of price means you need a fixed price. So you have to say 62 rupees or 65 rupees. You can't keep it open. Another school, which is an improvement, says you can have a floor. So I can say minimum 62, anything over and above that is also possible. Or I have a price band. So I can say within 62 to 72 or within 62 to 73, and within that I can arrive at any price. I think price band would do, but you cannot give it open-ended. So you cannot say that you can have any price at all. But either you have a floor or you have a band. If you have a fixed price, nothing like it. But like before, you can't have an open-ended price. I'll have any price under the sun. Bonus issue, SEBI guidelines do not permit a listed company to issue bonus shares out of revaluation reserve. So you can only do so out of reserves which have been recognized and realized. The Supreme Court in Bhagwati Developers v. Peerless allowed an unlisted public company and private companies to issue bonus shares out of revaluation reserve, and they went on to say that the SEBI guidelines do not apply to them. So that was the right thing to do. To overrule that decision, this now provides that even private limited companies cannot issue bonus shares out of revaluation reserves. So now they can only go through the other sources which are available to listed companies. 185 and 186, which have been in the limelight for a very long time, now over a year, because this, 185 was notified on 12 September 2013, and ever since there has been a lot of new cry. Similar to our earlier 295, loans to interested directors. There is a restricted category of loans under 185, which says directors and interested concerns cannot be given loans by any company, including a private limited company. And there is another section 186, which says that there are limits, disclosures, interest and processes to be followed by a company when it wants to give a loan or when it wants to invest in securities of any other company. This also applies to private limited companies. What are the provisions in a nutshell of 185? If you don't comply, penalty is 5 to 25 lakhs and 6 months of imprisonment. The draft notifications provide 185 will not apply to private companies having borrowings not more than twice their paid-up capital of 50 crores, whichever is lower, and in whose share capital no other body corporate has invested money. So this is what the draft notification of June provides, which has not yet become final. What are the transactions which are affected? If borrowers are interested concerns, then a loan by a holding company to its subsidiaries, whether Indian or foreign, even foreign subsidiaries, and we often have cases of Indian companies giving loans to foreign companies, which have been the subject matter of great debate under the transfer pricing regime. But now, even Companies Act steps in, you cannot give loans to those subsidiaries. Only exemption is holding company to wholly owned subsidiaries. So if 100% of the shares are held by you, then you will give a loan. If not, you need to check whether that subsidiary is covered within any one of the 5 interested concerns. The holding company cannot give a corporate guarantee, cannot pledge or mortgage its own assets for giving a security for a loan borrowed by a subsidiary, whether Indian or foreign. Now it is exempt in one scenario and one scenario only. If the guarantee or security is given to a bank or a financial institution, and that loan is used by the subsidiary for its principal business, then the holding company can give a guarantee, security or mortgage. Just pause and look at the exemption. Guarantee, security, mortgage, all done by holding company. Loan received from a bank or a financial institution by the subsidiary need not be wholly owned subsidiary, unlike in case of loan by holding company where it has to be 100% subsidiary, there it would be a 51% plus subsidiary also. The loan must be given by a bank or a FI. Bank we can understand. What is an FI? Is it restricted only to PFI as we understood under section 4 of the 56 Act? Answer is no. Section 2 of the 2013 Act defines a financial institution as one defined under Reserve Bank of India Act 1934. The section 45 IC of the Reserve Bank of India Act defines a financial institution to include any company whose principal business or part of business includes the following activities: buying and selling of shares, financing of any activity other than its own. In short, an NBFC is also a financial institution. So if you get a loan from an NBFC, your holding company can give a security, mortgage or pledge for the same, provided the subsidiary uses it for its own principal business and not for any other purposes. What is principal business? You will have to get into the test laid down by various court decisions and see whether it is for its own business. If yes, whether that business is principal or not. 3 gateways which were available under the 56 Act, now allowed by the 2013 Act. Loan guarantee security by private limited companies totally out of the ambit of 295, now covered under 185. a loan from loan to a non-wholly owned subsidiary was allowed, now not allowed. Guarantee for other than principal business was allowed, now not allowed. And there was another provision which was very relevant. You could apply to the regional director and get permission from central government for any such activities. Now that has been done. This is the first time where they have done something detrimental to their own interest. And it has brought a full stop to a lot of other activities which was prevalent under the NCA. Now that's no longer possible. Intercorporate loans and advances. Our old 372A, earlier 372, now 186. So there is a restriction on giving a loan, giving a guarantee to any person or to investing in securities beyond limits requires special resolution. 372A says loan or guarantee to any body corporate. 186 says loan or guarantee to any person. So an individual, an HUF, an AOP, a trust, a partnership, all would be covered within the limits of 186. Investment in securities has to be of a body corporate, so that continues as before. Limits are same as before, 60% of capital plus reserves or 100% of reserves and premium. Minimum interest for a loan pegged to the government security rate for the applicable tenure of 1, 5 or 10 years. So if you want to give a loan, you must ensure that the minimum interest is at par with the GSEC rate. Applicable to private limited companies also. Exemption, special resolution not available, not applicable if loan to wholly owned subsidiary or JV or acquisition by an NBFC. So these are the only two exemptions which are available here.
So this means that it will include loans to employees also if it has to be company's policy.
Yes.
That also.
Consent of PFI required where term loan in certain cases. Now, let us just pause for a moment and look at this 185 and 186. There has been one question which has been plaguing a lot of people. If I cannot do something under 185 and it starts with the words notwithstanding anything contained in any other provisions of the Act or subject to the provisions of any other provisions of the Act, no company shall do the following. And then 186 gives the limits under which you can do something. Can I bypass 185 by saying I have complied with the resolution under 186? Answer, in my view, is very clear, you cannot. 185 operates in a different sphere, 186 operates in a different sphere. 186 first lays down what are your limits. Within that, 185 says what you cannot do. What you cannot do directly, you cannot do indirectly by bypassing it and routing it to 186. If that were the intention, then 185 would be rendered odious altogether. Nobody would be covered under 185 because 186 is very easy relatively to comply with. Therefore, it would be and one of the principles of interpretation is you should not render any word in a statute odious or irrelevant. Hence, what you first carve out, what you cannot do. Then you come to the universe of what you can do. Within that, look at the limits under 186 and then comply with the procedural requirements laid down there. There is that, according to me, is the only correct way of looking at 185 and 186. And even earlier, when 295 and 372 were applied, it was very clear you need to comply with both, not either this or that. Public deposit is something where there has been a lot of hue and cry. And I agree with what Anand said yesterday, that you must read the public deposit rules. If you are not going to read the other rules, it's fine. Do read this, because this is something where there has been a lot of sea change. Let's look at the sphere of raising of public deposits. So you have private limited companies and you have public limited companies. Public limited companies have been divided into two classes, small companies and eligible companies. So eligible companies are those which have a large capital base or a turnover base. Small companies can only accept public deposits from its members. Eligible companies could get public deposits from anyone under the sun. Private limited companies and small companies both can get only deposits from members. So that is a big curve on fundraising activities by private limited companies. Look at it if you are a private limited company. My holding company cannot give me loan unless it's my 100% holding company, because 185 applies to it. If I want to issue shares, I need to go through the big process of preferential issue and private placement, which is time consuming, cost ineffective. If I want to raise public deposits, I can only get it from members. Where do I get funds from? And this is why I feel we are choking up the lifeblood of the public funds in private limited company, and it's going to be very difficult to carry on business unless your promoters have a lot of money and they keep complicating and share capital, which is the myth to look at. What is not a public deposit? So this you can get raised even today in a private limited company. Any money from a government or a non-resident. So any FDI or ECB is allowed. Money from FI or a bank as loan facility or financial assistance, ICD, intercorporate deposit allowed. Although the word is intercorporate, corporate here should be read as only company. So it's company to company. LLP, though a polycorporate, LLP are lent to a company and it cannot be out of the public deposit sphere. Share application money, 60 days time limit, or else it is treated as public deposit. Money from directors, here there was earlier an exemption for relatives of directors and relatives and members, that has been removed. So now relatives of directors is even covered as a public deposit. Debentures must be compulsorily convertible within 5 years or secured on the assets. Optionally convertible like before would not be excluded. Promoter loans, provided there is a stipulation to that clause. And this section, which is a new one, please read it and understand the implications in your business. Any amount received for business of the company as advance or security deposit for goods and services. Advance towards sale of property, which must be adjusted against the property as per the agreement. Advance against long-term projects for supply of capital goods. And if any of the above three are refundable, then exemption only available up to 15 days, or else it becomes a security deposit. One important caveat: if you are selling a property and you enter into an agreement for sale for an immovable property, and you have no permission or no provision under the sun to sell the property, then in that event the amount which you receive, even though it is under a sale of property, would be treated as a public deposit. So if I have a property which is in the sphere of CRZ, Coastal Regulation Zone, and I don't have permission to do anything in that property, and I get an advance for that, which is nothing but a disguised public deposit. Because I didn't have permission for selling that property, it would be treated as a public deposit if wanted to, and that would become a public deposit violation by the receiver. So do check whether you have permission to sell the property which you purport to sell. Only then would it be outside the exemption, inside the exemption of the public deposit. And any amount received from employee not exceeding his annual salary and non-interest bearing security deposit. What is not a PD? The draft notification says that this section would not apply to private companies having 50 or less members if the money accepted from members is less than 25% of paid-up capital or less than 100% of capital, whichever is more, and ROC should be informed in the prescribed manner. So then you don't need to get into the rules which we will look at next. What are the key conditions for deposits? Now here, I can only accept them from members and no one else. And if I want to accept from members, these are the conditions. It can be secured or unsecured. Option is that of the company. The ceiling is 25% of capital plus reserve. Tenure of 1 to 6 months. 6 to 36 months. Ceiling on interest of 12.5% per annum. Deposit insurance is compulsory after 31st March 15. Trustees are a must if your deposits are secured, not if they are unsecured. And you need a DRR, deposit retention reserve, of 15% of deposits maturing in a financial year and in the next financial year to be put in a separate bank account which should be used only for that purpose. Related party transactions, lot of talk has happened on that. I think Manchuka is dealing with them in depth in his case study. But if you look at the related party list under 276, and incidentally, our chamber's issue of last month was a related party transaction. Do look at that. You had an excellent, from different facets, looked at what are RPTs under various laws. It will give you a very bird's eye view of all the relevant regulations which look at related party transactions. Now, you need a special resolution in 4 conditions. It falls under one of the 7 RPTs under 188. Incidentally, the ambit of related party under section 188 is very narrow as compared to that under clause 49. Under clause 49, everything with a related party is a related party transaction. Under 188, everything with a related party which falls within the 7 transactions mentioned under 188 would be covered as a related party transaction, not otherwise. If it is an 8th or a 9th transaction, you don't need to do anything. So first check whether it falls within these 7. Next, is it in the ordinary course of business? If yes, okay. If no, then is it on an arm's length basis? No. And is it a prescribed transaction in exceeded of the threshold limits? If the answer is yes, then you need a special resolution. Now, what are prescribed as 7, what are prescribed as special are easier to understand. But what is the ordinary course of business and on an arm's length basis of prices? Now, arm's length, we have enough of domestic and international transfer pricing to understand by now what is arm's length. The same valuation methodologies would now be applicable even here. So we already had 48 on our plate, and now we have to demonstrate that even here, that this is on an arm's length. How would you demonstrate managerial remuneration whether it's on an arm's length is anybody's guess. So how would you say, because you don't have a comparable uncontrolled price for a private limited company. So then you need to look at other methodologies and say this is on an arm's length. What is the ordinary course of business? First, it should be business. Next, it should be ordinary. Now, business, as Supreme Court in Distributors Baroda has said, it's an organized systematic activity. Even an adventure in the nature of trade could be a business. Even a one-off transaction could be a business if it has an indicia of you wanting to do it regularly, if you wanting to do it on a systematic basis. Frequency, magnitude, quantum are some of the facets which you would look at when you look at what is business. And here, the tests which we look at under income tax law for capital gains versus business income, when we look at shares and securities, would be quite relevant in determining whether it is business or not. What is ordinary and what is extraordinary? Here, you can look at some of our accounting standards, AS5, AS1, anything which is in the course of business, or which is something which would not be germane to the objects of the company, would be treated as ordinary. Do you necessarily have to go by the memorandum main object clause and say only what is there in the main object is ordinary, or can I go beyond it? I think you can go beyond it also. Everything is, the memorandum is not sacrosanct, it's not cast in stone forever to come. So you should look at an auditor and a natural test. Would this be something which a company would do normally? Would it be something which I would do with a stranger? If it is something which I can do with a stranger, and that according to me is the blue line test or the sniff test, then it is in the ordinary course of business, even if I do it with a related. There is a recent press report which seems to suggest that the Ministry of Corporate Affairs is trying to look at defining these two terms. What is ordinary course and arm's length basis? I personally feel it's best they don't try to define. Because for every company, how are you going to define what is ordinary and what is arm's length? Leave it to the facts and circumstances of each case. If you look at a one-size-fits-all definition, we will have chaos. This is something which should be horses for horses. Look at it whether it fits the facts of this case. What is good for the goose is not always good for the gander. Therefore, leave it as it is and don't get into defining these terms. You will have mayhem. As it is, they suffer from myopic vision. And then trying to define such a vast term, we will have a lot of problems. So all 4 conditions must be satisfied. Member who is a related party cannot vote on such a special resolution. Here there has been relaxation by the Ministry of Company Affairs, which is clarified that related party only with reference to the contract or arrangement for which special resolution is being passed and must be contextual. So if you have a holding company which is making a slump sale of its undertaking to the subsidiary, all the directors of the holding company are related party under the new company act. Now, but are they related party in the transaction which is taking place? What are they gaining when a company is selling to a subsidiary? Nothing. Therefore, they can also vote if they are shareholders in that company. Hence, related party must be contextual and seen in the relevance and in the context of the transaction which is being looked at. Incidentally, clause 49 of SEBI guidelines has not incorporated the same definition. what if private companies want to enter into related party with members? And all members are interested in the related party transaction. Who will vote if a special resolution is needed? These are questions for which there are no easy answers. Hopefully, the amendment bill which was moved yesterday by, or which was to be moved yesterday by the finance minister, the company amendment bill 2014, has some answers for this. But till we look at the fine print, and the devil is always in the details, we will not be able to take any steps. Consolidation mandatory even if you have subsidiaries, joint ventures, and associates. So not just subsidiaries, even JVs and associates. Consolidation is mandatory for private limited companies also. Some relaxations, if you are not required to consolidate under AS 21, then prepare abridged consolidated financial statements as given in Schedule 3 of the Act. Nothing to be done for 14-15 if you have no subsidiaries but only have joint ventures and associates. I would ideally like to have a total exemption for private limited companies, but this is the minimum which they have done. Managerial personnel, key managerial personnel who is full-time, cannot hold office as a full-time key managerial personnel in any other company except its subsidiary. Any other company includes a private limited company also. Now, what do you define as a key managerial person? A managing director, a CEO, a full-time director, a CFO, a company secretary. So, if they are CEO or a full-time director in one private limited company or one public limited company, he cannot be appointed as a key managerial personnel in any other private or public company. Although he can be a director in any other company. But there is an exception. A managing director in one company, whether public or private, can be a managing director in one more company, whether public or private. So, of the full-time key managerial personnel, MD is given a special status, rest are not given. What does he need to become an MD in another company? Consent of all the directors of that company. Under the 56 Act, MDs in private limited companies are not considered altogether. Some changes for MD of a private limited company. He must be between the age group of 21 to 70. Maximum tenure of 5 years at a time, both of which were absent under the 1956 Act. So what is the fallout of compliance, Raj? We had lights. So this is the fallout what happens. Even the lights. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So, oh, I'm sorry, you don't have. Okay, so registration of companies has dipped by 50%. If you compare the. But then I don't have anything to look at. So if you look at April to August of 2013, 43,000 companies were registered. The same duration in this year, April to August 2014, is 21,000. So over 50% drop in the companies registered with MCA because of the new Companies Act. I wanted to show you the next chart, which was quite interesting, but unfortunately we are not able to look at that. The falling trend of private company registrations. Between April to March 2014, an average of 8. The moment we started LLP, it again came back. So I guess we just wait till we get visuals again. This chart is quite interesting. So what this shows is the number of companies registered month after month from April 13 till date. In the last year, that's good. In the last year, you had an average of 8,000 companies a month. And then sometimes in May 13, it went up to as high as 10,000 companies a month. This year, the average is 4,400 a month. So that shows the drastic drop in the number of companies which are being registered as a consequence of the Companies Act 2013. That's why I say it's a dying breed altogether. What is the flip side of that? of the compliance Raj. You have a rising trend of LLP registration. From April to September, LLPs every year are going up. So if you look at the linear exponential trend, it's a one-way street. So that's why I said first we had license Raj, then we had approval Raj, now we have compliance Raj. So private company, is there any silver lining available? Yes. If you look at the draft notification issued under 462, the differential voting right rules will not apply to private limited companies. ESOP, ordinary resolution instead of special resolution. Public deposit rules we saw will not apply to certain types of companies. No general meeting notice, voting, quorum, proxy, chairman. Can appoint an auditor who is a partner of a CA firm if he has audited more than 20 companies. No minimum deposit of 1 lakh required for appointing a director. Special resolution of certain matters not applicable to certain types of private limited companies. Intercorporate loans 186 not applicable to private companies. Related party transactions not applicable. And appointment of full-time director, federal government approval not required if not as per Schedule 5. All these have been provided since the last 6 months, but nothing has happened on them. I don't think the company's amendment bill addresses all of this, because if you look at the press release, it's very small. There are only 10 items, and only 1 or 2 of them may be covered. But till we see a fine text, we can't say whether this is going to be covered now or later. But it does look like it would come. Till such time, we have no option but to comply and go through the private limited company regime. So what is the panacea for all this? Panacea used to be in the Greek days, the golden pill. If you took that, you would never fall sick. So is LLP the panacea for all ills? Let's compare an LLP with a private limited company. Can I take public deposits? No, in a private limited company. Yes, in an LLP there is no restriction. Can I give a loan to directors or partners? Company cannot lend to directors and interested persons. No restrictions in LLP. Incidentally, this also is there under Income Tax 222E in case of a company, not there in case of an LLP. Limit on loans and investments 185 and 186. No such law currently in LLP. Related party transaction long list. No such law in case of LLP. CSR not applicable to LLP, applies to private limited company. Method of accounting approval could be cash or accrual. NBFC hurdle. Now, while we are on the topic of private limited companies, I want to just draw your attention to a recent fishing expedition launched by the RBI on a pan-India basis. Left, right and center, you are getting notices from Morley written by one Mr. Ashok Mehta. From a prima facie reading of the balance sheet, you appear to be an NBFC. Please show cause notice by action should not be taken under 45 MA of the RBI Act. You reply, and the next one goes, we do not agree with your representation. In our view, you are an NBFC. Show cause will be taken against you. Please also furnish the email ID of your auditor for taking action against him. And then that goes to the CA Institute for Disciplinary Action. This is what has been happening on a pan-India basis. I have seen at least 50 such notices, all of them being photocopies of the same notice, and only the name is being changed. So what that means, if you are a private limited company and you are owning shares, and people think that I have my own funds, I have not borrowed a single rupee, and I have invested in the share market, why should I be treated as an NBFC? But 3 years ago, the RBI took a paramount decision that investment, whether for, or rather buying share, whether for investment or trading purposes, is NBFC. Whether you like it or not, we will treat you as an NBFC. This happened in Jan 2011. Till then, they used to go by the theory of investment versus trading. Now, moment you buy shares in another company and it is not your principal business to do financial business, you would be covered as an NBFC. This does not apply to LLPs, and LLPs can do investment, although there is a different story to that. So, what's the option? Become an LLP. And what are the mechanisms possible? Whether practically possible is a different story, and we'll look at that. One is convert into an LLP under the LLP Act, slump sale or an itemized sale to an LLP, merger of a company or demerger from a company into an LLP, and a run-up and run-down. Now, just as when you fall sick, you take a pill, but sometimes the pill has side effects, and the side effects could be worse than the ill. So here also, if you you want to convert, do consider the side effects. And that is what I also want to highlight. What are the side effects of conversion under each of those four cases? Some more statistics, very interesting. Look at the number of LLPs formed by conversion into companies under the LLP Act. 12 in 10, 34, 56, 64 and 129. So last year showed 129 private companies being converted into LLP under the LLP Act. I am sure in the next couple of years this is going to be by far breached altogether. How do you convert a company into an LLP? Now, under the LLP, the Limited Liability Partnership Act of 2008, Section 56, read with third schedule to the LLP Act, allows a company to convert into an LLP. There is a statutory vesting by the provisions of law. There is no transfer of undertaking from the company to the LLP. It is an inbuilt provision under the statute. Automatically, when you apply to the ROC, he will treat as if the company has gone out of existence, and in its place an LLP has formed in which all the assets and liabilities of the company, erstwhile company, are statutorily vested, and the erstwhile shareholders become partners in the LLP. No separate conveyance is required, and the law is very clear in that there is a statutory vesting of the property. It is similar to conversion of a firm into a company under what we had as Part 9 of the Companies Act 1956, under which we could incorporate a public limited company from a partnership. What are the eligibility criteria for conversion? It must not have any security interest. So security interest means it should not have any secured creditors. Or if it does, then you would need their permission and you would have to go through that route. Consent of unsecured creditors is required. Partners of the LLP become shareholders of the company. All accounts and filings with ROC have been done. Latest income tax report is filed and attached. So this is an interesting and important condition. Permissions, if any, have been obtained. So these 6 are what the LLP Act provides. In addition, there is a 7th provided by the consolidated FDI policy. If you have FDI in a company, you need FIPB permission for converting it into an LLP. So that's the corollary of the 6th condition. Any permission required for conversion must be obtained and attached. So if you have FDI in a company, you cannot bypass it. You must go to FIPB, get permission for conversion, and only then will they allow you to convert. There was a case where a real estate company, M4 Realtors of Cochin, went to FIPB. They had FDI in the company and wanted to convert it into a LLP. And they said, no further FDI. Only what is there will continue. FIPB said, what you cannot do directly, you cannot do indirectly. FDI in a real estate LLP is not permissible. Therefore, FDI after conversion in a real estate LLP, not permissible. What's the process for conversion? Name availability, filing of forms and documents with ROC, prepare an LLP agreement under Section 4 and file it with the ROC. You get a certificate of LLP incorporation by the ROC, and then the LLP will file a form with the ROC. So this in a nutshell, I'm not going into procedural matters and rules and form numbers, but these are the key elements of converting a company into an LLP. Yesterday, incidentally, I think somebody asked a question that if an LLP owns shares of a company, would it be a private LLP or a public LLP? And Anand very rightly mentioned there is no such concept of a private or a public LLP. To further illustrate this point, if you look at the shareholding of Reliance Industries Limited, entire promoter shareholding of 56% is held by LLPs. That obviously does not make Reliance a private or a public company. There is no brainer on that. So that would give you the best example of LLP owning shares in a private limited or a public limited company. Look at RIS shareholding pattern, entire promoter shareholding is under LLP. In fact, when this news hit Economic Times front page 3 years ago, the RBI woke up and realized that, oh my god, LLP gives rise to regulatory arbitrage. We would be out of business, all the NBFCs will automatically go and convert into LLP. We will be left high and dry because NBFC means company and LLP is not a company who will be regulated. And therefore, they issued a diktat to the ROC Any LLP coming to you for incorporation, any company coming to you for conversion, which has investment and financial services as its main object, will require an NOC from the RBI, otherwise you will not incorporate, and RBI is not giving that NOC. Now, how can we have any discussion and not look at income tax? Because in India, everything is first driven by tax and rest fall back later on. So if you want to convert a company to an LLP, there is a tax-free conversion possible, provided you comply with 6 conditions. That's under 47, subsection 13. All the assets and liabilities of the company become that of the LLP. The shareholders become partners with profit sharing ratio and capital ratio as same as that in the shareholding percentage. Aggregate profit sharing of the shareholders in excess of 50%, or rather more than or equal to 50%, continues in the LLP for 5 years. No benefit to shareholders other than profit share and capital. Gross receipts from business and profession of the company are less than or equal to 60 lakhs in any of the preceding 3 years prior to conversion. No amount is paid to partners out of accumulated profit for 3 years. We look at these conditions in detail in the next slides. But these are the 6 key conditions which you have to comply. If the above are not met, Section 47A provides that the gains on transfer of capital asset will be deemed to be gains of the LLP or the partners in the financial year of non-compliance. Let's look at the conditions a little bit more in detail. All the assets and liabilities of the company become that of the partners. Easy to comply because this is not a transfer, this is a statutory vesting, but not just that of the business. If you compare this with 4713, when a sole proprietor is converted into a company, it says all the assets and liabilities of the business become that of the company. So therefore, if you have any non-business assets, you can hide them off before conversion. Here we say all the assets and liabilities of the company become that of the LLP. So everything, whether business assets, idle assets, non-business assets must become that of the LLP. That's an important distinction between 13 and 13B. Shareholders become partners with profit sharing ratio and capital same as that as shareholding percentage. So capital contribution and TSR is equal to shareholding percentage in company. Now what happens if there is more than one class of shares? So you have equity, preference, non-voting right. How do I look at the shareholding percentage? Do I look at only equity or do I look at an aggregate? I think only equity could be one way of looking at it, but it could be a very aggressive view and would be fraught with a lot of litigation. If you want a safer green channel approach, take the aggregate capital ratio, add up all equity, preference, DVR, that should be in the same proportion in the LLP. Aggregate profit share of shareholding more than or equal to 50% continues in the LLP for 5 years. Very important condition, but needs to be looked at very carefully. Aggregate of all partners put together. It does not say that each partner must have 50% in the LLP. If there are 10 partners, 10 shareholders, 10 of them put together as a block must continue for 5 years, 50%. Internally, you could change. It could happen that all partners exit but only one continues, or it could happen that half of them exit and half continue, or all continue with 50% being exited. LLP must continue for 5 years and cannot go out of existence. So that is the key thing which you need to look at, that the LLP must continue and so hold on. Now what would happen if there is only one partner? Or there are two partners, and one of them is holding more than 50, other is holding less than 50. The person who is holding more than 50 dies. Can you say that there is a violation of this condition and therefore 47A is attracted? I would think no. If you look at the principle of mischief rule, why was this incorporated? It was incorporated so that there are no fly-by-night conversions. Now when a natural event occurs like death, or when a company which is a shareholder and now a partner goes into liquidation, you cannot say this is a violation of the condition, and hence there must be a harmonious and a liberal interpretation to the provision, and you must not apply 47A. Having said that, you and I both know that theoretically what I am saying makes sense, but practically when we go for the event, it will not make sense. No benefit to shareholders other than profit sharing ratio and capital? What about interest and partners remuneration? No answer here on that. If you pay any partners remuneration, which is natural and normal for working partner, or you pay interest on partners loan, would it be treated as a violation of this condition? I don't think no, but again, something which is going to be litigation prone. But in my view, no. The intent is that you should not give any benefit. But this is not a benefit arising out of conversion. This is a natural benefit. Even when he was a shareholder, he was paid remuneration as a director. Why should he not get paid remuneration as a partner? Most important and difficult condition to comply with. Gross receipts from business or profession of company are less than or equal to 60 lakhs in any of the CBDT prior years to convert. CBDT has issued a circular. It is only the amount taxable as business and profession which is to be considered. So that means if you have any house property income, any income from other sources, any capital gains, that is not to be considered. Only if it is taxable as business and profession do you look at it for the 60 lakhs criteria. Can it exceed in the year of conversion? Yes, because it looks at the 3 preceding years. So if I am converting in financial year 15-16, up to 14-15 I need to look at. 15-16 I could even go up to 1 crore or more. What is turnover? There is no answer. Look at the cases under tax audit under 4480. Would it be gross or net of VAT or excise duty? Now here you look at the Supreme Court decision in Chaudhary Sales Bureau, where they have said that even if you don't add VAT as part of your turnover, it is your business receipt and then the company will get a deduction for that. Could that be used to say even VAT should be added for looking at your turnover of 60 lakhs? Very possible. No amount paid to partners out of accumulated profits for 3 years. What is accumulated profits is not defined. The Companies Act defines accumulated profits in a similar sense when it says free reserves includes all profits available for distribution as dividend. Therefore, dividend would be treated as accumulated profit. Share premium and revaluation reserve, in my view, are not accumulated profits, so any benefit paid out of that would not be treated as violating the condition. Recently, there was a decision by the Kolkata Tribunal in Aravalli Polymers LLP where they said even loan to a partner out of accumulated profits violates the condition and therefore vitiates the exemption.
Capital itself can be
Capital. Brought forward losses and unauthorized depreciation of the company become that of the LLP in the year of conversion. So 72A provides for this. Conditions for 4713B are a must, or else, if you violate, the losses become the income of the LLP in the year of non-compliance. Can you say 8-year carry-forward period starts afresh in case of conversion? I would say yes. Because what does it say? The brought forward losses of the company become that of the previous year in which the conversion takes place. So say 7 years have elapsed, in the 8th year conversion takes place, you get a fresh window of 8 years for business loss. Unabsorbed depreciation as it is infinite. Would 79 apply to the erstwhile company? Can you say that 79 is violated and therefore carry forward of losses will not be available because now the shareholding may have undergone a change? The company itself is not in existence. Look at it like this. 79 says notwithstanding anything contained in this chapter. 72A says notwithstanding anything contained in the provisions of this act. What is superior? The act or the chapter? In my view, the chapter is subservient to the act. Therefore, 79 is a subset of 72A. When 72A permits you to do something, and 72A is a later provision compared to 79. Therefore, 79 has no locus standi when there is a corporatization of a company into an LLP, and you cannot say that I will not give the benefit of carry forward just because there is a change in shareholding or something of that sort. Depreciation to the LLP on the same WGB as that to the company, no step up available, and naturally so because there is a statutory vesting, it is not a transfer. Prorated appreciation in the year of conversion between company and LLP divided by the number of days the company was in existence, number of days the LLP was in existence. Actual cost holding period of capital asset same as that to the previous owner. Natural discount would also be indexation from the same year of holding based on the Bombay High Court decision in Manjula Shah and Delhi High Court in Kanpur Trust, it would be for the same logic as previous owner of holding. Cost of acquisition of rights of the partners in the LLP, same as cost of acquisition of shares in the company. What are profits and reserves credited to partners' accounts? So if there are profits and reserves which are credited on conversion, what is the cost for them? No cost? I don't know. MAT credit of company cannot be carried forward to LLP. Obviously, it would lapse for conversion because MAT is not a concept under LLP law. And tax holidays in the company, what happens to them? I have an 80IAB or I have an 80AB holiday. Would it lapse? And if you look at all the tax holidays, they are qua and undertaking. They are never qua and associate. Undertaking continues even after conversion. And drawing an analogy from part-time conversions, where there is the Punjab High Court decision in Rita Mechanical or the Jodhpur Tribunal in technology books, the undertaking continues in existence even after part-time was converted into a company. Same logic, the undertaking continues even after company is converted into LLP, hence tax holidays will continue even after conversion. Now let us spend some time on the recent Kolkata Tribunal decision, which is good in parts, bad in parts. Aramco Polymers LLP. Here what happened, in the year of conversion itself, the LLP paid a loan to the partners out of accumulated profits. So what the tribunal said, you don't need to go to 47A because that happens if you first comply and then violate. In here, you've never complied only. So you've never got the exemption under 4713B. Hence the question of going to 47A does not arise. So therefore, you have to look at the corporatization on a standalone basis. And it would be taxable under 45(1). My view is it was never taxable even without the exemption, because if you look at the principles laid down in TechSpin in Bombay High Court in TechSpin Engineering, a part-time conversion is a statutory vesting and there is no tax liability at all. We'll just look at that in the next slide. Further, in this case, what happened is the LLP was, or the company was holding shares of East India Hotels, that's the Oberoi Hotels. The AO took the fair market value of the assets on the date of conversion, reduced from it the cost of acquisition in the hands of the company, and treated the difference as capital gains. Here, thankfully, the Kolkata Tribunal says you can't do that. Where does the statute provide for notional capital gains? Is there a law similar to 50C? Is there a law similar to 43CA? Answer is no. Therefore, only take the book value of appreciation in the assets. What is the figure represented by the net worth? That becomes the capital gains in the hands of the company, and you have to tax on that basis, is what the Kolkata Tribunal said. So far so good. But let us go back and see, would it be a tax neutral corporatization even if you don't comply with 4713B? Here we have two important decisions, Bombay High Court in TechSpin and Rita Mechanical in Punjab and Haryana. Both are from a firm converting into a company. They say there is a statutory vesting, ROC is duty bound to incorporate, there is no dissolution or transfer otherwise under 45(4), that is on account of retirement, death, dissolution. No consideration at all flows to the partner, to the partnership firm or the company, and hence principles of computation under 48 fall. Therefore, in my view, there is a very good case that there is no capital gain even if you don't comply with the exemption conditions of 4713B. A question is often asked that if there is no capital gain, then why did they provide for an exemption? So here, look at the Shaw, the Privy Council decision. Privy Council was equivalent to the Supreme Court under the British law. The Privy Council decision in Shaw was that sometimes the draftsman out of his own anxiety provides for an exemption which is not needed. And in the absence of that exemption also, the exemption was always available. It does not mean that just because he provided, I have to comply with it and I don't get the exemption. Even without it, I get an exemption. To give an analogy, earlier, amalgamation was not treated as a transfer. So there in Kanga and Palkiwala, Mr. Palkiwala has given his views that amalgamation is tax neutral even without the exemptions under 2(1)(b), and you don't need to comply with what is treated here. It always was tax neutral. It now so happens that in Grace policy, the Supreme Court has said that amalgamation is taxable, and hence it changes the law. But under an LLP conversion, even if you don't comply with 47(13)(b), there's a very good case of saying this is a tax neutral conversion. Is there a very good case of litigation? Definitely. And all the best to you if you decide to take that view. So I'm only giving you that this is the theoretical position and this is the ground reality. There is a big slip between the cup and the lip. How you bridge it, and if you bridge it, it's up to you. What about stamp duty on conversion? We have 47(13)(b) at least to give us some shelter. Is there any such provision in Stamp Act of any law in this state, in this country? No. What is the position under Part 9? Here you had two very old decisions. Calcutta High Court in Ramsundari and Andhra Pradesh High Court in Vani Pratikada House. Both of these held that under Part 9 conversion there is no stamp duty because the statutory vesting, you don't need a conveyance, no immovable property transfer is taking place. Same logic should apply even under an LLP law, and therefore there is no requirement of paying stamp duty on conversion. Again, does the registrar